Richard, let's take it back to the very beginning. When was the first moment that you knew you were gay?
Well, I was born in 1955 in Stuyvesant Town here in New York City. When I was probably 6 or 7, my earliest memories are of being attracted to men. And at that age, it wasn't like it was men on television. Like, and so in elementary school, then later at 7, 8, 9, 10, there was a singer named Ricky Nelson, who was on a TV show, about a family.
He's very handsome.
Yeah,
Ricky Nelson.
and I remember having a big crush on Ricky Nelson and mentioning it to my father. And I remember him being horrified and just saying, well, boys don't say that about other boys. And it was like a revelation to me, like, oh my God, I have exposed myself in a way that I made sure not to do again for a very long time. You have to start by remembering that culture is a mirror, and that when we look at TV and movies and art and literature, we're looking for ourselves to be reflected back in that mirror. And if the culture has made you invisible and you don't see yourself in that mirror, it means you don't exist, or that your existence is negligible and marginal. And so...
Is that how you felt when you were growing up?
Well, sure, there really were no openly gay role models that I knew about. There were just really gay jokes or references to sort of the dark lives of queers or homosexuals. I remember as an undergraduate at Hamilton College in upstate New York when Leonard Matlovich was on the cover of Time magazine.
And for the listeners who don't know who that is, who's Leonard Matlovich?
He was an openly gay serviceman in the U.S. military. I mean, I think he was expelled, but he was he came out as a proud gay man, and he was a news sensation. And being on the cover of Time magazine, that meant something in those days before social media and a digital world. And so he was a major news figure at that time, and I remember grabbing the magazine in the school library and reading about it. Like, here's this gay man. It was a reflection back to me that we existed, that I existed, and that, at that time, each queer kid, lesbian, gay, whatever, you thought you were the only one. You didn't know there were gay people who led adult lives, happy lives, constructive lives. And so if you think you're the only one and you don't see a pathway to a future, it can fill you with despair. So seeing the mirror of a gay man on the cover of Time magazine was like, oh, there is someone out there. Even if he's being kicked out of the military, he's alive. He's a grown-up. And that's the power, I think, for us of history, is to make sure that rising generations of queer kids know that we exist and that there's a pathway for them that's wonderful.
And when did you actually end up coming out?
I came out my sophomore year at Hamilton College, which was probably late 74, early 1975. So just 5 or 6 years after the Stonewall riots.
What was it like being out in the mid-70s as a college student?
Well, I had, before coming out, I'd really struggled with, I didn't see a future for myself. I didn't care about my academics very much. I was just in despair. And once I came out, that really changed. Well, one day this is really what helped me come out. I was going into one of the dining halls, and there was a little 8.5 by 11 sign hanging on a wall at the entrance of the dining hall. All it said was Sappho, the word Sappho, at 7:30 p.m. in a room in one of the dorms, a meeting room. And I thought, well, Sappho is a lesbian poet, Lesbos. Maybe this is a lesbian writers group, or maybe it's a gay student union. And so I thought, I'm going to go. I was super nervous. And I walked into the little meeting room, and indeed it was a lesbian and gay caucus, if you will. And again, there were more lesbians and maybe
It's like
three
underground.
guys. Oh yeah, very much so. It made me feel exuberant and excited, and just bouncing up in the air, excited.
And after college, you kind of jump right into this, what is now a decorated career of LGBT justice. But back in those days, that wasn't very popular to go into
Right.
queer work. In the late 70s, you start working at one of the, I guess, the queer paper of record is what we know of it now, the Gay Community News. What had inspired you to kind of go from college to LGBT activism?
Well, I think in hindsight, again, I was very lucky. I had by the time I was a junior or a senior, a younger friend, a young woman a couple years behind me, who was from Boston, and she said, there's a weekly newspaper in Boston called Gay Community News. So the weekly newspaper began coming to the library, and I would read it each week. And it said in the back, it was produced by a collective and that people could join the collective. And I had a friend from high school who was going to divinity school at Harvard in Boston. And I thought I could move to Boston, become a waiter, and start volunteering at this newspaper, and I can live with my friend from high school, Peggy. It's a 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom apartment. I remember the rent in 1977 was $225.
I was like, don't even tell me.
So each bedroom was $75. I started volunteering at GCN, which was indeed a collective, and ultimately got a job as the office manager. And then later, I became the managing editor in 1978.
Wow.
And we viewed the newspaper sort of as a weapon of gay liberation. We didn't talk about gay equality. We talked about lesbian and gay liberation.
What did that term mean, liberation, to you, as opposed to equality?
Well, it certainly meant wanting a gay rights bill, but it didn't mean wanting gay marriage. It meant wanting to dismantle the nuclear family.
Wow.
It didn't mean wanting to join the military. It meant dismantling the military state. I mean, it was, we've all evolved or changed because I'm a married gay now. But, it was a different approach that was very widespread among young people.
Well, you participated in the 1979 March on Washington for gay and lesbian rights. Tell me about that march and what was it for, and what was your memory of it?
Well, in the 1970s, there was not really a truly national lesbian and gay movement. It was really regional movements, because remember, this is before email or texts. It was before fax machines. Most people didn't have computers. If you had an electric typewriter, you were fancy. And long-distance calls were hugely expensive. Different people, some people credit Harvey Milk before he was killed. Some people credit others. We're having the idea that we need a national march for lesbian and gay liberation and equality. And here I am in this Friends Meeting House where all these people from around the country are yelling at each other. You have like the gay Democrats from San Diego and the radical black lesbians from New York City, the Salsa Soul Sisters. And most of these people had never met, but we had to come together to hammer out what was the march going to be for, what was it going to be called, and what was our list of demands. And so the march happened on October 14th in 1979, and at the Gay Community News, we did a special edition, a guide to the march. And so my colleague Amy Hoffman and I rented a small U-Haul truck. It was bright yellow, filled it up with all these newspapers, and I drove it to D.C. to drop all of these papers off in all the gay bars in D.C. So all the gay people coming in from around the country, where do they go? Go to the gay bars or the feminist bookstores, Llamas, I guess it was, and get the guide to the march. But in any case, the march itself was very, very exciting. There had really never been a gathering of so many gay people together in the United States in one place.
What did you all accomplish with the march?
Well, the impact was all these regional movements were now the beginning of a national movement because all of these people now knew each other. They had gotten to know each other fighting and cooperating and collaborating to create this march. So there were relationships between leaders around the country in ways that hadn't existed before. And you know how when you're young you can feel invincible?
Oh, absolutely.
When you're 22 or 23, and I felt like I'm invisible, I'm gay, and nobody's going to shut me up. But all my friends, I wasn't like I was the only one. My friends were exactly the same.
I want to skip ahead a little bit. You were one of the most important leaders of the AIDS movement, and certainly ground zero for that, which was the LGBT Center. But when was your first time hearing about AIDS? Take me to that moment.
Well, I think it was probably around the time that the New York Times had the story about GRID, gay-related immunodeficiency.
1981.
So this is before AIDS. I was having a very active gay life in San Francisco. I mean, we would go out to bars every night, hook up. It was...
You're talking about like a sex life.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was great. And it was before AIDS. This was fall of 81. I remember sitting at dinner with some friends in San Francisco, and there were all these theories about how you got AIDS. And there was theories like, because this is before the discovery of the HIV virus, okay? No one knew anything. And there was one theory that if you have more than 1,000 sex partners, your immune system could collapse, where that came from. Or an excessive use of poppers, that could cause AIDS. I mean, people, we all believe that. I stopped using poppers. You also have to remember, in the minds of the government and the media, the mainstream media, and in corporate America, gay people were completely disposable. And the fact that as it emerged that AIDS affected intravenous drug users and gay men, there was a perception that maybe we're better off without those people. I remember there was a state legislator in California who got a lot of press for calling for camps for people with AIDS. William Buckley in the New York Times, he was the editor of the National Review and, one of the leaders of the right in America, the intellectual right. He, in an essay in the Times, said that people with AIDS should be tattooed. And...
you remember how you felt when you read that?
We were so enraging. And and the fact that the Times would publish that shows you what they thought of us. And remember, newspapers and media have style guides, that reporters and editors follow. And the style guides at that time for the AP, Associated Press, the Times, the Wall Street Journal, you were not allowed to say Jordan, a gay man. It literally was Jordan, an avowed homosexual. That was in the style guide, and that if you go back and look, that's how we were referred to. So we really were despicable and disposable.
Initially, were you scared for yourself?
Sure. Every time you got a cold, you thought, this is it. And I'm not kidding. Every gay man you knew, every friend you had, you got a cold. Oh, God, I wonder if this is it.
Because that was one of the initial symptoms.
Well, yeah. And also, there was no HIV test.
Do you remember your first friend that was impacted by AIDS? Sort of the first time it felt like it was close to home?
I had a couple of close friends, Stephen Salabaher, Bob Andrews. Stephen Salabaher was an attorney in private practice who I was the chair of a board in 1978 that created a queer legal organization for New England. It's called GLAD Law now. And Steve was the guy when AIDS happened who I asked if he would be the volunteer lawyer who would lead our AIDS law project. And my then boyfriend, Tom, we used to go on vacation with Steve and his partner, not husband, his boyfriend, Ralph. And I remember the first time he was hospitalized, and I went with a friend, Kevin Cathcart, to visit him, and we had to put on gowns and masks to go into this isolation unit.
He was leading the
This
AIDS
law
sort of
project,
right,
yeah.
and ironically had
And yes, and ultimately died.
well in the mid '80s. You then go to head up the New York City LGBT Center.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about what the role of the center was in the AIDS movement.
By the time that I came from Boston in December 1st, 1986, to be the executive director, there was 2 or 3 staff. There was a lesbian in hard hat in the basement who shoveled the coal because it was heated by a coal furnace,
Wow.
about a ton a day in the winter. And there were other helpers she had. And then there was like an office manager who scheduled the rooms, like you're organizing queer journalists for New York. You want to book a room for a meeting. And he'd say, how about Tuesday at 7? He'd say, okay. And because of this is before the digital life, everything was through flyers, phone chains, and the mail. And the center published what was then every other month, but then a monthly newsletter and calendar. And so you're organizing lesbian and gay journalists of New York, and you want to start attracting people. And so you book a room. We're going to put that in our calendar. And then we're going to mail that calendar for free to anyone who wants it. And, so by some point in the 90s, there were like 80,000 subscribers who got, and this newsletter was supported by advertising. It like therapists and lawyers and gay diners would advertise in the newsletter, and people would read about your meeting, and people that you didn't know and didn't know each other would come to this meeting. And suddenly you would have an organization and a network. And so very quickly, the number of queer organizations in New York multiplied dramatically, because you think, how was Gay Men's Health Crisis founded? Well, it was founded in Larry Kramer's living room by people who Larry invited that he knew into his living room. How was the National Gay Task Force founded in 1973? In Bruce Feller's kitchen, by people he invited into his kitchen. Suddenly you had a mechanism whereby you could meet in a meeting room at the center and attract all these people who didn't know you and didn't know one another but liked your idea.
This was radical in terms of expanding queer networks.
And organizing and building a movement. So, and this would be everything from gay opera lovers, lesbian motorcycle riders, gay softball or volleyball, bridge clubs. But it was also how, South Asian lesbian and gays got organized, SALGA, and then decided to fight to march in the India Day Parade.
Wow.
It's because all those people didn't know each other, but they read, you had a great idea, you put it in the calendar, and people came together. And the center charged rent. It was $2 a person. So if 10 people liked your idea and showed up, the rent was $20. If 100 people showed up, it was $200. And you just pass the hat and say, hey, $2 everybody.
Yeah.
And then you'd go upstairs to the office and you'd pay.
So tell me about the founding of ACT UP, because that, for listeners, ACT UP was the incredibly effective organization that was pushing the government to find effective AIDS treatments, and it was founded at the center while you were the executive director. So tell us that story.
The first cultural program of the center was a program that still exists today. It's called Second Tuesdays. And on the second Tuesday of the month, a figure would be invited to come speak. Like you could have written a novel or written a Broadway play, and you would come, and we would charge like $3. and in an auditorium, and people would come in and hear you talk. And it was run by volunteers at the center, usually board members, not always. And so in early 1987, the person running Second Tuesdays, a board member named Diana Leo, had invited Nora Ephron, the writer and filmmaker, to be the speaker. A lot of the rom-coms, the old rom-coms like with Diane Keaton or people, she wrote those or directed them. She got sick, got a cold, and canceled a couple days in advance. And so Diana Leo, who was running the program, scrambled and called up Larry Kramer, who she knew socially. And she said, Larry, Nora's sick. Can you come talk? And he said, okay. And then he began to put out the word that on his network that he was going to make an important talk about AIDS. So remember, this is 87. AIDS got underway in 82, 83, 81. So on the first floor auditorium, on the second Tuesday of the month in the spring of 87, Larry comes and gives this very powerful speech, very angry speech to the gay people in the room, like, you're killing yourselves, that we weren't fighting, that we were just passively dying, not demanding, not fighting for who we are. And he really got people charged up. The actor Martin Sheen showed up, which was like a little buzzy thing. And so people said, well, we need to come back next week. And someone ran upstairs to Robert Woodworth, who was the person in charge of the scheduling, and said, can we come back next Tuesday? And Robert said, well, no, Tuesday's booked, but you can have Monday. And so that's why ACT UP met every Monday night at like 7 o'clock or something. And so they met in the first floor auditorium, and ACT UP really exploded, and then went and created ACT UP chapters in Chicago, San Francisco, Paris.
Richard, at that time, the center was also the host of many funerals, AIDS funerals. And I think that you have such a unique point of view as the leader of the center. On the one hand, you are watching ACT UP in a lot of ways meet success with their actions and their demands. On the other hand, you're literally seeing how people are still continuing to die. And the center was kind of ground zero for all of that. Right. You're sort of in the middle of this and have that unique point of view. And I wonder what that felt like for you, kind of to be in the middle of that complicated, those two worlds.
Yeah. Well, you're right. The whole experience of multiple loss dramatically impacted our community. When the gay friends I knew who got very sick and were close to death, they stopped wanting to see people except for their boyfriend or their family, because they didn't want people to see them that way. Also, in a movement, in a workplace like the center at that time, where people on the staff get sick and die, people on the board get sick and die. So in a workplace, suddenly people are crying. People are very physical with each other, hugging each other, like in ways that might not work out in a workplace today. Then it was normal. In the 90s, late 80s, early 90s, who I would visit in the hospital for like a last visit, and maybe in hospice or just in the hospital, and they would ask me, they would say, will you please speak at my memorial? And sometimes these requests would come from people that I didn't know well, but because of my job as the head of the LGBT Center in New York, and I realized they were asking me not just to speak about them, but to make a angry memorial talk about AIDS and who they were in our queer movement.
Mm.
I realized multiple people ask me, and it took me a minute to realize, oh, this is what they want. They want their family and the world to know that they had lives as activists and that they were killed, if you will, by the indifference and hatred against us. Even though, for example, I was not a caregiver, primary caregiver for anyone, everybody was pulled into sort of some degree of community care. And the executive director of the queer senior group, SAGE, had been a guy named Ken Dawson, really major leader in New York's queer community in the 80s. And he'd left SAGE and he was sick and dying, and I was just part of the group. I remember being asked to go spend an evening with him so his boyfriend could have the night off. And he was going blind, and so I was to read him his mail. And before his boyfriend left, he said, oh, you need to change the IV drip. And I was terrified. I'd never changed an IV drip. And I was thinking, what if there's an air bubble and I do it wrong? I could harm him. And the boyfriend showed me how to do it and then left. And obviously was under tremendous strain and stress of caring for Ken. But that experience was very common. Like, you'd be doing that.
Yeah.
So when I think of, my father, who, he died in 1982, but he had enlisted, and he was from Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, and he enlisted in the Army when he was 17, and he ended up in Paris. But for him, World War II was, I think, the dominant shaping experience of his life. When he got back, he went to college afterwards on the GI Bill and really jumped classes, all of that. But it was what shaped him. And for my generation, AIDS was our war. And when we were in it, that's how we thought of it. We were in a war.
You were very involved in the New York City AIDS Memorial. And I wonder what got you involved in that. And tell us a little bit about it, too.
So around 2012, these two then young guys, Christopher Tepper and Paul Kelterborn, met, I don't know, I think at a community board meeting. And they had each read a book called And the Band Played On, about AIDS in San Francisco.
Randy Shilt's
book. And as Chris tells the story, they both realized they knew nothing about AIDS. They were young gay men, and they just knew nothing. No one had taught them, told them, and they were shocked. And they both had urban planning backgrounds. St. Vincent's Hospital in Greenwich Village had gone bankrupt, a Catholic hospital, and
that was sort of where a great many AIDS patients were treated.
It was the first AIDS ward in the city, and the old Tool building of the hospital was physically backed up against the LGBT Center, like we shared a wall.
Oh, wow.
So Chris and Paul said, this building is being sold to developers, the Rudin family, and there's an opportunity for us to have an AIDS memorial. There was a triangle of land on 7th Avenue and 12th Street that had been underground, a multi-level basement underground, with an underground tunnel under 7th Avenue and under 12th Street from the hospital buildings. And so medical waste and people who had died, bodies, all came in underground and then were trucked out from this triangle. So Chris and Paul had the idea that, let's make this an AIDS memorial. So they came to see me and for advice, and we began to meet and talk regularly about how to organize to make this happen. The architect who designed the World Trade Center Memorial, he chaired the design competition. It all happened, it opened on World AIDS Day, December 1st, 2016. So the whole thing took just over 4 years, which is really fast.
Yeah.
And all the construction, everything had to be finished. And then the land was deeded over to the city and is now an official New York City Park. And the New York City AIDS Memorial is now like a park conservancy.
Wow.
And it's a board that raises money, and they, deal with the planting and the anti-graffiti and fix the skateboard damage and produce tons and tons of cultural programming around AIDS.
I want to ask about the museum. It's going to open in 2027, the American LGBTQ Museum, and clearly there's a thread throughout your life of preserving queer history and wanting the next generations to experience it.
We began organizing around this Museum of Queer History in January of 2017. So it'll be, we're finishing up our 8th year. And there had been multiple efforts before then to create a National Museum of Queer History, and, they would falter and fail. There is a Museum of Queer History in San Francisco in the Castro that focuses on California. There is the Stonewall Museum is in Fort Lauderdale that does exhibitions. But this will be the one that we hope will truly be our American museum. So we've been working on it for 8 years, and it's not the kind of museum that's just going to have objects that you say, oh, isn't that interesting, when Harvey Milk was alive. We very consciously want to be a school for rising generations of activists. We view this museum as the cultural arm of our movement for queer liberation and equality. We not only want to preserve our history, celebrate it, but we want to interrogate it and look at, what did our movement do wrong? How did we blow it? How can the next generation do better? We want to, if you think again of the idea of culture as a mirror, who's been made invisible by our mainstream culture? Who stories have not been told? And how can we tell them so that all of our queer people see themselves as part of a tribe that is set aside, that is resilient, and that will ultimately flourish?
Even though this show is about queer history, it's really about passing things down from one generation to the next. And I wonder, for you, what do you want young queer people to know about this history?
It's very easy to lose heart, to feel like it's hopeless, to feel like, why should I bother to get involved? Because it doesn't make a difference. During the AIDS epidemic, our people were dying, and our government didn't care. Ronald Reagan laughed. Ed Koch, our mayor, did nothing, closeted gay man. And our queer people came together and fought and took care of our own and demanded more and got more and developed tremendous progress, more progress than I ever imagined would happen in my lifetime. And so what I hope younger people will take away from our queer history is an understanding that we're a resilient bunch of people who can get organized and fight back and win, and that it does take every one of us. Every one of us has an obligation, a duty, a responsibility to build our community and to take care of those who can't. Like, I want every gay kid to know that's their responsibility. It's not an option, Get off your ass and do it.